The contract had been a document of elegant, brutal simplicity. It spoke of services, of duration, of compensation. It used words like discretion and performance and non-disclosure. It did not use words like fear or loneliness or the specific grinding exhaustion that came from pretending to be someone you were not in a world you did not belong to. Alara Vance had signed it not out of greed, but out of a quiet, calculated desperation, the kind that makes you very good at math, the kind that lets you weigh the value of your own soul against the price of a life free from the crushing gravity of debt and failure. She was a decoy, a wife in name and public appearance only, a beautiful, placid shield for a man who moved through the world like a phantom limb of the city itself. Jinwoo Kwon. His name was a whisper in the circles that mattered, a low hum of power that vibrated beneath the foundations of finance and industry. To the public, he was the reclusive chairman of a global logistics empire. To the few who knew better, he was the head of the Golden Phoenix Syndicate, a man whose influence was not measured in stock prices, but in the silent obedience of other powerful men. Her job was to be visible, to attend dinners, to smile at galas, to wear the jewels and the gowns that made her a glittering, unignorable target. She was the distraction. While eyes were on her, his real business, his real life, could move unseen in the shadows she cast. She understood this. She was, before all this, an architect. Not a successful one, but a good one. She understood structure, load-bearing walls, and facades. She was, in essence, the most beautiful facade ever constructed. Tonight, the facade was a column of emerald silk that whispered against the marble floors of L'Apogée, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, only a reputation. The room was a study in hushed opulence, a cathedral of modern capitalism where deals were consecrated over plates of artfully arranged food. Alara sat opposite him, the candlelight catching the facets of the diamond earrings that felt like tiny, cold weights on her lobes. They were part of the uniform. Jinwoo was, as always, a portrait of stillness. He did not fidget. He did not make unnecessary gestures. His presence was a null field, a pocket of calm in the ambient static of the room. He wore a charcoal suit tailored with the kind of precision that made it seem less like clothing and more like a second skin. He was watching her, but it was not the predatory gaze she had grown accustomed to from other men. His was an observational look, the way a scientist might study a fascinating, unpredictable variable. It was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was simply attentive. She had learned to read the minute shifts in his composure. The slight tension in his jaw meant he was displeased. The barely perceptible narrowing of his eyes meant he was processing a new threat. Tonight, he was perfectly relaxed, which was the most unnerving state of all. It meant he was expecting something. She took a sip of her water, the crystal glass cool against her lips. Her own internal landscape was a stark contrast to his calm. It was a high-alert state, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that she had learned to mask with a placid smile and serene posture. She was a performer, and this was her stage. She catalogued the room out of habit. The table of Russian industrialists to their left, loud and florid. The Japanese tech mogul and his entourage in the corner, silent and severe. And the man holding court at the central table, Viktor Sokolov. Viktor was the antithesis of Jinwoo. Where Jinwoo was silence, Viktor was noise. He laughed too loudly, gestured too broadly, his swagger a cheap imitation of genuine power. He was a dealer in arms and information, a man who thrived on chaos, and he had been a persistent, irritating thorn in Jinwoo's side for months. He had a face like a spoiled Roman emperor, fleshy and arrogant, and his eyes, when they landed on Alara, were coated in a greasy film of possessive appraisal. He saw the emerald dress, the diamonds, the woman seated opposite the powerful Jinwoo Kwon, and he saw an acquisition, an object to be taken. He had not updated the file on her. He was working from a version of Alara that had never been accurate. He saw a trophy. A beautiful, empty vessel. He did not see the architect who could calculate the stress tolerances of steel in her head. He did not see the woman who had survived the slow, grinding collapse of her family, her career, and her hope, and had still found the strength to sign a contract with the devil to save herself. Jin Woo followed her gaze, his own eyes resting on Victor for a fraction of a second. There was no animosity in his expression. It was simpler than that. It was the look of a man noticing a piece of grit on a polished floor, an imperfection to be swept away at his convenience. The dinner progressed. The first course arrived, a mosaic of seafood so delicate it seemed a shame to eat it. Alara ate, or performed the act of eating. She listened to the low murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware on porcelain, the entire symphony of wealth and power. Her senses were stretched thin, taut as piano wire. She felt a shift in the room's atmosphere before it happened, a subtle drop in pressure, a change in the quality of the light. Victor was standing, a glass of champagne in his hand. He was making his way toward their table. It was a breach of the room's unwritten code. You did not approach another man's table uninvited. It was a challenge. Jin Woo did not move. He did not even look up. He continued to study the swirl of red wine in his glass, as if Victor and his entourage of 2 hulking bodyguards did not exist. Quan, Victor's voice was a slurry of expensive liquor and entitlement. Always a pleasure to see you spending my money. It was a crude reference to a recent shipping contract Jin Woo had wrested from him. Alara felt her spine stiffen. This was it, the expected event. She kept her eyes on her plate. Her role was to be decorative, to be silent, to not exist in these moments. "And you brought your pretty little toy," Victor continued, his gaze falling on Alara. It was hot and invasive. "She is very beautiful. You have good taste. For a man of your background." The insult was deliberate, a clumsy jab at Jinwoo's origins, designed to provoke a reaction. Jinwoo gave him nothing. He simply lifted his glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Victor's face flushed a blotchy red. He was being ignored, rendered impotent. He turned his attention back to Alara, as if she were the easier target. He reached out, his thick fingers intending to touch her shoulder. "Perhaps when he is tired of you, you can come and see me. I will show you what a real man is like." Before his fingers could make contact, Alara looked up. She did not flinch. She did not gasp. She looked directly into his eyes, and her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and cold as ice. "I would advise against that." The words hung in the air, a stunning departure from her scripted role. Victor froze, his hand hovering. He looked surprised, then amused, then angry. The idea that the toy could speak, could issue a warning, was an affront to his entire worldview. Jinwoo finally looked up from his glass. His eyes met Alara's, and for a fleeting, unreadable moment, she saw something new in them. Not surprise. Recognition. Victor laughed, a harsh barking sound. "She has spirit." "I like that." He dismissed her warning, his arrogance reasserting itself. He turned back to Jinwoo. "You are a coward, Quan, hiding behind your money and your woman." And then everything happened at once. It was not Victor who moved. It was the quietest man in Victor's entourage, a man who had been standing slightly behind him, almost lost in the shadows. He was not a bodyguard. He was something else. Alara had seen his type before, in the periphery of Jinwoo's world, the men who did the wet work. His movement was a blur, economical and swift. His hand came up, and it was not empty. The object in his hand was small and black, a compact pistol fitted with a suppressor that would turn the cannon crack of a gunshot into a dull, pneumatic cough. Time seemed to stretch, to become thick and viscous. Alara saw the trajectory. The man was not aiming at Victor. He was not aiming at the bodyguards. He was aiming directly at the center of Jinwoo's chest. She did not think. There was no conscious decision, no heroic calculus. It was instinct, a purely physical reaction born of 1,000 hours spent calculating angles and forces. She saw an object on a collision course with another object. Her body, the shield, was closer. She moved. It was not a graceful dive. It was an awkward, desperate shove, her chair scraping back against the marble as she threw her own body into the space between the gun and Jinwoo. The sound was exactly as she'd imagined. A cough, a dull, wet phut, and then the pain. It was not a sharp sting, as she might have expected. It was a sudden, shocking heat that blossomed in her left shoulder, a brutal, fiery impact that felt like being struck by a molten fist. It stole her breath, radiated down her arm and across her chest, a white-hot supernova of pure agony. She did not scream. The force of the impact threw her sideways into Jinwoo. The emerald silk of her dress was suddenly horrifyingly wet and warm. She heard a glass shatter. She felt his arms come around her, not in a romantic embrace, but in a solid, grounding hold, preventing her from collapsing completely. The world tilted, the opulent restaurant dissolving into a blur of smeared light and distorted sound. The last thing she saw before the darkness pulled her under was Jinwoo's face. His expression was no longer calm. The stillness had been shattered, and in its place was something she had never seen before. A cold, absolute, and terrifying fury. It was the look of a sovereign whose most valued possession had just been deliberately broken. Chaos erupted, but it was a controlled, directed chaos. The pop of the suppressed gunshot had been small, but the sight of Alara collapsing against Jinwoo, the dark stain spreading across her emerald dress, was a bomb detonating in the center of the silent room. People gasped. A woman shrieked. Chairs scraped back as diners scrambled away from the epicenter of the violence. But Jinwoo did not panic. He did not shout. He held Ilara, his hand pressing firmly against the wound in her shoulder, a futile attempt to stem the bleeding. The fabric of his suit, the perfect charcoal wool, was darkening with her blood. He looked down at her pale face, her eyes fluttering shut, and the cold fury in his own eyes condensed into something harder and more dangerous than diamond. He moved with an unhurried precision that was more terrifying than any frantic action. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady, yet it cut through the rising panic like a surgeon's scalpel. Minjun. His right-hand man, who had been seated at a discreet table near the entrance, was already on his feet, moving toward them. Minjun was a man who seemed to have been born in a well-tailored suit. His face was perpetually impassive, his movements economical. He did not run. He simply arrived. He was already speaking into a device on his wrist. Protocol Azure. I repeat, Protocol Azure. Asset compromised. The shooter, the quiet man from Victor's entourage, was attempting to fade back into the chaos, but he was not fast enough. Two of Jinwoo's men, who had been dining as ordinary patrons at separate tables, converged on him. There was no struggle. One man disarmed him with a single brutal twist of the wrist, while the other drove a fist into his kidney. The shooter folded with a silent gasp, his face contorted in pain. He was dragged away, disappearing through a service exit with an efficiency that suggested this was a well-rehearsed drill. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The power had shifted. It had not just shifted. It had been vacuumed from every corner of the restaurant and consolidated into the still figure of Jinwoo Kwan, kneeling on the floor with a bleeding woman in his arms. Viktor Sokolov stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. This was not his plan. The plan was a clean, quiet assassination. A rival removed. The ensuing chaos would have been manageable, deniable. But this was a public spectacle. A botched hit that had injured the woman, the beautiful Decoy, and left him standing over the scene like the guilty party. He looked from the shooter being dragged away to Jinwoo's face, and the arrogance finally drained from him, replaced by the cold, clammy sweat of pure fear. I didn't, he stammered, taking a step back. That man was not with me. I don't know him. Jinwoo finally looked up at him. His eyes were flat, devoid of any emotion save for a deep, chilling promise of consequence. He was not performing. He was not angry in the way other men were angry. This was the kind of rage that doesn't burn hot but freezes everything it touches. You are a guest in my city, Victor, Jinwoo said, his voice a low rumble. You have been a poor guest. He did not need to raise his voice. Every person in the restaurant heard him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. Sirens that Minjun had undoubtedly summoned, and which would be met by men who would control the scene long before any official police force arrived. Jinwoo shifted his attention back to Alara. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was surprisingly tender. Stay with me, Alara, he murmured, his voice for her ears only. More of his men had filled the room, appearing from nowhere. They wore dark suits and earpieces, their presence creating an invisible, impenetrable perimeter around their boss. They moved with the quiet competence of a pride of lions securing a kill. One of them knelt beside Jinwoo, opening a medical kit that seemed to have materialized out of thin air. The exit is secure, sir, Minjun reported, his voice low. The vehicle is waiting. Dr. Han is on standby at the residence. Take him, Jinwoo said, his gaze still on Alara. He did not have to specify who him was. Two of the dark-suited men turned toward Victor. The Russian industrialist's bodyguards, who had been standing uselessly by, made a half-hearted move to intervene, but a look from Minjun froze them in place. They were professionals. They knew a lost cause when they saw one. They knew the difference between the hollow, performed power of their boss and the deep, structural power that was now being wielded by Jinwoo Quan. Victor started to babble, his words tumbling over each other. This is a misunderstanding, Quan. A terrible mistake. We can make a deal. I have money. I have contacts. He was pleading, his voice high and thin. The swagger was gone, stripped away to reveal the terrified, weak man beneath. He was not brought down because he was evil. He was brought down because he was stupid. He had miscalculated. He had mistaken a queen for a pawn and had tried to take her from a king on his own board. The men took his arms. He didn't struggle. He simply sagged between them, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. As they led him away, his eyes met Jinwoo's one last time, filled with a desperate, begging appeal. Jinwoo did not acknowledge him. He had already dismissed Victor from his reality. He was an issue that had been delegated, an error that was being corrected. His entire focus was on Alara. He carefully gathered her into his arms, his movements fluid and strong. The medic had already applied a pressure bandage, but the blood was still spreading, a stark, ugly flower on the pale landscape of her skin. As he stood, cradling her against his chest, he surveyed the room, the diners, the staff. All of them were frozen, witnesses to a brutal transfer of power. His gaze swept over them, cold and impersonal. It was not a threat. It was a statement, a memo being distributed to everyone present. This is what happens when you touch what is mine. He walked toward the exit, his men parting before him like the sea before Moses. He did not rush. His pace was steady, deliberate. He moved through the wreckage of the evening with the air of a man leaving his own office at the end of a long day. The king was leaving the board, and he was taking his queen with him. The game was over. The cleanup had just begun. The world returned to her in fragments. First, the scent. Not the metallic tang of blood or the cloying sweetness of antiseptic, but something clean and subtle, like rain on cool stone and fresh linen. Then the feeling. A dull, throbbing ache in her shoulder, a heavy, contained pain that was a distant country from the fiery explosion in the restaurant. And finally, the sound. The soft, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, a steady counterpoint to the silence. Alara opened her eyes. The ceiling was white, bare, and impossibly high. She was not in a hospital. Hospitals had a smell of institutional despair and disinfectant that clung to everything. This place was different. It was sterile, but not sterile. It was silent, but it was the kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. She turned her head slowly, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She was in a large, minimalist room furnished with shades of gray, white, and black. A single perfect orchid sat on a low table. Through a vast window, the city glittered below, a sprawling galaxy of light. She was high above it all, in the eagle's nest, Jin Woo's penthouse, and he was there. He sat in a severe black leather armchair near the bed, not looking at his phone, not reading a book, not doing anything but watching her. He had changed out of the blood-soaked suit. He now wore a simple black turtleneck and dark trousers, an outfit that seemed to absorb the light around him, making him even more of a fixture of stillness and shadow. His face was unreadable, but his posture, leaning slightly forward, was one of intense focus. "You're awake," he said. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. His voice was the same low, calm instrument she was used to, but it seemed to hold a new resonance in the quiet room. Ilara tried to push herself up, but a sharp, lancing pain in her shoulder made her gasp and fall back against the pillows. An IV line tugged at the back of her hand. "Do not move," he commanded, though the words were spoken softly. Dr. Hahn said the surgery was successful. The bullet passed through cleanly. It missed the artery, but it shattered a portion of your clavicle. There will be a significant recovery period. She absorbed the information. Surgery, clavicle, recovery. They were just words, data points to be filed away. Her mind, the architect's mind, was already trying to assemble them into a coherent structure. "Victor?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Is no longer a concern," Jin Woo replied. The finality in his tone was absolute. Viktor Sokolov had been deleted from the world. He was a corrected error, a closed file. She did not need to ask for details. She knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever had happened to him was total and irreversible. A silence fell between them, filled only by the soft beep of the monitor. Ilara looked at him, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time since she signed the contract. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, a faint shadow that hadn't been there before. She saw the way his hands were clasped in his lap, his knuckles white. He was not as unshakable as he appeared. "Why?" he asked, the single word dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Ilara knew what he was asking. He wasn't asking about Victor. He was asking about her, about the moment in the restaurant, the shove, the bullet. She considered her answer carefully. The truth was, she didn't fully know. It had been an impulse, a reaction faster than thought, but she could not say that. To him, impulse was a weakness. Everything had to have a reason, a logic. "It was a tactical decision," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "My contract is to act as your shield, a visible deterrent. In that moment, the threat became kinetic. The most effective way to fulfill my function was to physically intercept the projectile." She was talking like a security report, using cold, detached language. It was a defense mechanism. He listened, his expression unchanging. He seemed to be weighing her words, searching for the truth within the careful, clinical phrasing. "You were hired to be a decoy, Ilara," he said slowly. "To draw attention, not to take a bullet. The contract does not stipulate self-sacrifice." "The contract also did not stipulate a live-fire scenario," she countered, a spark of her old self returning. "I improvised." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was a tiny, fleeting thing, but it was there. "You did." He stood and walked to the window, his back to her. He looked out at the city he owned, a king surveying his domain. "When I was vetting candidates for this position," he began, his voice reflective, "my security team brought me 100 files, models, actresses, socialites, all beautiful, all disposable." He paused, his gaze fixed on the sprawling metropolis below. "I threw them all away. They were looking for a facade. I was looking for a foundation. I found your file by accident, or perhaps my people are more thorough than I give them credit for. An architect, top of your class. Your thesis on structural integrity in hostile environments was compelling. You lost your firm due to a partner's embezzlement. You took on the debt to protect the junior employees. You have been enduring, quietly, for a very long time. Alara stared at his back, stunned into silence. He knew. He knew all of it. He hadn't just hired a pretty face he'd found in a society magazine. He had researched her. He had understood her. He had seen the steel beneath the surface. He had hired the architect, not the woman. I hired you because I knew you would not break, he continued, turning back to face her. I did not anticipate that you would try to shield me. The revelation was disorienting. It recontextualized their entire relationship. She was not just a prop. She had been chosen, selected for the very qualities she thought the world had overlooked and punished her for. Her resilience, her intelligence, her quiet strength. For the first time, she felt seen, truly seen, by the most unlikely of men. The contract is void, he said, his tone decisive. Your services as a decoy are terminated, effective immediately. A cold knot of fear formed in her stomach. Terminated. Was he letting her go? Throwing her back into the world she had fought so hard to escape, now with a shattered shoulder and an enemy's blood on her hands? As if reading her mind, he added, You are not being dismissed. The terms of our arrangement have simply changed. You are no longer an employee, Alara. He walked back to the bedside, his dark eyes holding hers. You are now under my personal protection. This is not negotiable. The people who did this will not stop with Victor. They will see you as a liability or a target. Leaving my protection is not an option. It was not an offer. It was a statement of a new reality. She had traded one contract for another, an explicit one for an implicit one. She was no longer a decoy wife. She was a protected asset, a ward, a prisoner? What do you want from me? She asked, the question raw and honest. Jinwoo looked at her, and the cold, unreadable mask slipped for a second time. She saw a flicker of something complex and deeply unfamiliar in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It wasn't desire. It was something closer to respect. For now, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, I want you to recover. I want you to heal. And then, we will discuss the new architecture of our arrangement. He had chosen the word deliberately. Architecture. He was speaking her language. He was acknowledging who she was. In that moment, Ilara understood. The bullet had not just shattered her bone. It had shattered the contract, the facade, the entire life she had been living. And in its place, something new, terrifying, and strangely hopeful was beginning to be built. The days that followed bled into one another, a slow, monotonous watercolor of recovery. Jinwoo's penthouse became her entire world, a gilded cage with a breathtaking view. The sun would rise, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and orange, and she would watch it from her bed. A private nurse, a quiet, efficient woman named Mrs. Choi, would tend to her needs, changing her dressings, administering her medication, and helping her with the slow, painful process of physical therapy. Alara felt a disquieting sense of displacement. Her life, which had been a series of deliberate actions and calculated risks, was now entirely passive. She was being cared for, protected, handled. Part of her, the part that had fought and scraped for every inch of her independence, bristled at the feeling of dependency. Another, more tired part of her felt a profound, guilty relief. For the first time in years, she did not have to worry about rent or bills or the gnawing fear of destitution. She only had to heal. Jinwoo was a constant yet distant presence. He would leave before she woke, a phantom who ran his empire while the city slept. But he would always return in the evening. They would share their meals in silence in her room, a rolling table set with exquisite food she barely touched. He would sit in the black leather armchair, sometimes reading financial reports on a tablet, sometimes simply watching the city lights flicker to life. The silence between them was no longer the awkward professional silence of an employer and his contracted decoy. It had become something else, a shared space filled with unspoken thoughts. She found herself watching him, studying the way he held his teacup, the subtle lines of tension that would appear around his mouth when he read something displeasing. He was a puzzle she was slowly, methodically trying to solve. She began to assert herself in small ways, reclaiming pieces of her autonomy. She refused the stronger painkillers, preferring the clarity of a dull ache to the fog of opiates. She pushed herself harder in her physical therapy sessions, driven by an architect's impatience with a structure that was not performing to specifications. One evening, about 2 weeks after the shooting, he came into her room to find her not in bed, but sitting at a small desk he'd had brought in for her, a tablet propped up in front of her. Her left arm was in a sling, her face pale with effort, but her eyes were bright with concentration. "Dr. Hahn said you should be resting," he stated, his voice neutral. "Dr. Hahn is a physician, not an engineer," she replied without looking up. "Idle hands lead to structural decay." She was scrolling through a complex document, a geological survey report for a new port development project in Incheon. She had asked Min Jun for access to his business files, a request he had relayed to Jin Woo with a raised eyebrow. To her surprise, Jin Woo had granted it. He walked over and stood behind her, looking at the screen over her shoulder. She could feel his presence, a warmth and stillness that seemed to alter the air around her. "Your soil composition analysis is flawed," she said, her tone matter of fact. "You're accounting for liquefaction risk based on a seismic model that's 10 years out of date. A 7.2 magnitude event, which is within the 50-year probability window for that fault line, would cause catastrophic failure in the foundation pilings you've designed. You need to switch to a deep soil mixing method and increase the depth of the caissons by at least 15 meters. Silence. She had overstepped. She was a patient, a protected asset. She was not a consultant. She had forgotten her place. "Show me," he said, his voice a low command. For the next hour, she talked, and he listened. She pulled up schematics, cross-referenced oceanic survey data, and sketched out new foundation designs with her right hand on the tablet. She was no longer Alara Vance, the decoy wife. She was Alara Vance, the architect. She was fluent, passionate, and brilliant. She was in her element, explaining the elegant, brutal logic of physics and engineering. When she was finished, she leaned back, exhausted but exhilarated. He remained silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the revised schematic she had created. "Min Jun," he finally said, speaking to the air. His ever-present assistant materialized in the doorway, as if summoned by thought alone. "Halt all work on the Incheon project. Send these new specifications to the engineering team. I want a revised feasibility study on my desk by morning, based on Miss Vance's projections." "Yes, sir," Min Jun said, his face impassive, but his eyes flickered toward Alara with a newfound respect. He bowed slightly and disappeared. Jinwoo turned his attention back to her. "You have a talent for finding weakness in a foundation," he observed. It was not just a comment on the port project. It was a comment on everything. This became their new routine. Her body healed slowly, but her mind, now engaged, worked at lightning speed. She became his secret consultant, his hidden asset. She reviewed contracts, analyzed market trends, and dismantled the strategies of his corporate rivals with the same cool logic she applied to building schematics. She found the flaws, the stress points, the hidden vulnerabilities. In return, he provided her with a sanctuary. He never spoke of the shooting or of the danger that still lurked outside the walls of the penthouse. But she saw the evidence of his quiet war. She would catch snippets of conversations between him and Min Jun. "The Brussels connection has been severed. Sokolov's offshore accounts have been liquidated. The politician he had in his pocket has resigned due to a personal scandal." Jin Woo was not just a gangster who used violence. He was a master of structural power. He didn't demolish his enemies' houses. He bought the mortgage, foreclosed on the loan, rezoned the land, and had the building condemned. His methods were quiet, legal, and absolutely devastating. He was waging a war on spreadsheets and in boardrooms, a war Ilara understood far better than one fought with guns. Their relationship deepened in this crucible of shared work and quiet companionship. One night, as they were working late, a thunderstorm broke over the city, the rain lashing against the panoramic windows. She was looking over a hostile takeover bid he was planning. "This is aggressive," she noted. "Even for you, you're not just trying to acquire the company, you're trying to erase it." "The man who runs it, Jean-Pierre Dubois," Jin Woo said, his voice low, was Viktor Sokolov's primary financial backer. "He funded the operation that resulted in your injury." Ilara looked up from the tablet, her heart skipping a beat. It was the first time he had directly referenced the cause of her being here. He was not just cleaning up a mess, he was avenging her. Every move he made, every company he dismantled, every fortune he ruined, it was all for her. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "Yes, I do," he replied, his dark eyes meeting hers across the table. "They saw you as a weakness, a vulnerability they could exploit. They were wrong. You are not a liability. You are my center of gravity." The corporate metaphor was so uniquely him, so devoid of traditional romantic sentiment, that it struck her with more force than any flowery prose ever could. He didn't see her as a damsel in distress. He saw her as a fundamental component of his own stability. In that moment, lying in her bed high above the stormy city, Ilara realized she was no longer afraid. The gilded cage had become a fortress, and the man who had built it was no longer her captor or her employer. He was her partner. The slow burn of their strange courtship had finally ignited into a quiet, steady flame. It was a partnership built not on passion, but on a far more solid foundation: mutual recognition, respect, and the shared, silent understanding of what it meant to build something that would last. Viktor Sokolov was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His life had been a long, unbroken series of acquisitions, of companies, of objects, of people. In his mind, the world was a simple marketplace, and he was its most aggressive consumer. The concept of permanent loss was alien to him. So, in the weeks following his public humiliation at l'Apogée, he did not despair. He fumed. He seethed. He was trapped in a 5-star hotel suite in a city he now loathed, his assets frozen, his lines of credit severed, his name a toxic asset in the circles where he once moved with impunity. Jin-Woo Kwon had not killed him. He had done something far more cruel. He had rendered him irrelevant. But Victor's arrogance was a renewable resource. He convinced himself that this was a temporary setback. Kwon was powerful, yes, but he had a weakness. A beautiful architectural weakness named Ilara Vance. Victor's mind, unable to process the complexity of the situation, simplified it into a narrative he could understand. Kwon was infatuated, besotted. The woman was not a decoy. She was the king's obsession, and anything a man obsessed over could be used as leverage. "He's keeping her locked away like some treasure," Victor snarled to the one lawyer he had left, a man with sweaty palms and frightened eyes. "It proves my point. She's his Achilles heel. Give her a week, maybe 2. She'll get bored. She'll want her old life back. She'll contact me." The lawyer, who had a much clearer understanding of their predicament, merely nodded and made a note on his legal pad, a note that likely said, "Find new client." But Ilara did not get bored. She did not call. The silence from Kwon's penthouse was absolute. Victor's delusion began to curdle into a more desperate, frantic energy. He had misjudged the timeline. He had misjudged the woman. He had misjudged everything. His first move was laughably clumsy. He had his lawyer file a series of frivolous legal claims: a lawsuit for emotional distress caused by the scene at the restaurant, a claim of unlawful termination of a business negotiation, a preposterous attempt to file a missing persons report for Ilara, claiming she was being held against her will. The legal papers were delivered to Jin-Woo's corporate headquarters. Min-jun brought the file to the penthouse that evening. Jinwoo glanced at the first page, a faint, contemptuous smile touching his lips. "He is throwing rocks at a fortress," he said, handing the tablet to Alara. She read through the documents, a frown creasing her brow. "This isn't about winning in court. This is about generating noise, creating a public record. He's trying to force you to acknowledge him. He's trying to attach his name to yours and mine in the press." "It will not work," Jinwoo said. "My legal team will have these filings buried by morning." "Burying them isn't enough," Ilara countered, her mind already working through the strategic implications. "He's using the law as a weapon of harassment. You need to turn the weapon back on him. You have the original contract, my contract. It has a non-disclosure and a non-compete clause that Victor's actions at the restaurant clearly violated by attempting to poach me. Your legal team isn't just defending, they should be attacking. Sue him for breach of contract, for tortious interference. The damages would be astronomical. It would be the final nail in his financial coffin." Jinwoo looked at her, his head tilted in appraisal. He had built an empire on aggression and overwhelming force, but her mind worked on a different axis. She saw angles he missed. She saw how to use an enemy's own momentum against him. "Min-jun," he said, without looking away from Alara. "You heard the lady. Instruct the legal team to proceed as she suggests, aggressively." The legal counterattack was swift and brutal. Victor, who thought he was initiating a minor skirmish, suddenly found himself facing a full-scale invasion. His last remaining assets were targeted, his reputation systematically shredded in legal filings that painted him as a reckless, unstable business liability. The rocks he had been throwing were now being fired back at him from a cannon. Cornered and hemorrhaging the last of his borrowed money, Victor escalated. His delusion hardened into a single fatal objective. He had to get to Alara. He had to prove she was his to take. If he could just confront her, confront them both in a public setting, he could shatter the illusion of Kwan's control. He could expose him as nothing more than a jealous brute guarding a possession. He learned through a well-paid informant, a foolish caterer who would soon be unemployed, about the upcoming Obsidian Gala. It was the city's premier philanthropic event, a night where the titans of industry and finance gathered to outbid each other for charity and, more importantly, to see and be seen. Jinwoo Kwan was one of the event's co-chairs. He would be there, and he would undoubtedly have Alara on his arm. This was it. This was his stage. Victor began to prepare. He called in his last favor, securing an invitation from a minor European royal with a gambling problem. He spent the last of his liquid funds on a bespoke tuxedo, a new haircut, and a dose of liquid courage from a bottle of vintage scotch. He was a man preparing for his coronation, entirely blind to the fact that he was actually walking toward his own scaffold. Meanwhile, in the penthouse, Jinwoo's preparations were of a different nature. Min-jun stood before him, delivering a report. "Sir, as you anticipated, Victor Sokolov has secured an invitation to the Obsidian Gala. Our source confirms he intends to make a public confrontation." Jinwoo nodded slowly, his fingers steepled before him. He was looking at a live feed of the gala's ballroom, where teams were making the final preparations. The lighting, the seating charts, the security camera placements. He had overseen every detail. Alara entered the room, moving without the sling for the first time. Her shoulder still ached, but her movements were regaining their natural grace. She wore a simple silk robe, her hair damp from a shower. "He's coming, isn't he?" she asked. She had known this was inevitable. An animal like Victor, when cornered, would always charge. "Yes," Jinwoo confirmed. "The security can handle him," she said, though it sounded more like a question. "My security is the best in the world," he agreed. "But this is not a matter for security. This is a matter of narrative. Victor has been trying to write a story in which he is the wronged party, and I am the tyrant. Tonight, in front of everyone who matters, I am going to let him finish his story. And then I will write the epilogue." He stood and walked over to a wardrobe that stood open. Inside, hanging in a protective sheath, was a gown. It was the color of a midnight storm, a deep, shimmering emerald green that seemed to drink the light. I had this made for you, he said. A new dress, for a new beginning. Ilara looked from the dress to his face. She understood. This wasn't just a gala, it was a stage. It was the final act of a play that had begun with a gunshot in a restaurant. And Jinwoo was not just the director, he was the architect of the entire production. Viktor Sokolov was not crashing their party. He had been invited in a way. He was the guest of honor at his own execution. The trap, baited with arrogance and sprung with precision, was set. The ballroom of the Obsidian Gala was a galaxy unto itself. Constellations of diamonds glittered on necks and wrists, and the ambient light was refracted through 1,000 crystal champagne flutes. The air hummed with the low, powerful frequency of consolidated wealth. It was a room where nations were casually discussed, where markets were moved with a quiet word, where a single handshake could be worth $1 billion. Ilara felt the familiar tremor of anxiety as she stood just outside the grand entrance, but it was a distant echo now, not the paralyzing roar it once was. The emerald gown felt like armor, cool and smooth against her skin. It was an architectural marvel, cut with such precision that it seemed to support her, to hold her upright. Her shoulder was a dull, persistent ache, a physical reminder of how far she had come. Jinwoo stood beside her, a figure of absolute calm in his perfectly tailored black tuxedo. He did not look at the crowd. He was looking at her. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "I don't leave because things become complicated," she said, echoing words he had once said to her in a different context. A rare, genuine smile touched his lips. He offered her his arm. "Then let us make our entrance." As they stepped into the ballroom, a subtle ripple went through the crowd. Conversations did not stop, but they lowered in volume. Heads turned. Jinwoo Kwon was a rare sight at such events, and the woman on his arm, a stunning, unknown figure whose poise and beauty outshone every socialite in the room, was a mystery. They saw a power couple, an enigma. They did not see an architect and her sovereign walking into a battle of their own design. They moved through the room, Jinwoo nodding curtly to those who dared to catch his eye, Ilara offering a serene, distant smile. They were a self-contained unit, an island of stillness in the swirling sea of the gala. They had just taken their seats at the head table when she felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, a new current of tension. She looked toward the entrance. Viktor Sokolov had arrived. He stood there for a moment, letting the room take him in. He was trying to project an aura of defiant confidence, but it didn't fit. His tuxedo was a size too tight, his face was flushed, and his eyes had a wild, desperate sheen. He looked less like a returning conqueror and more like a man who had just run up 10 flights of stairs. He spotted them immediately. Ignoring all decorum, he began to stride across the ballroom, his path a direct, aggressive line toward their table. A few of Jinwoo's men, disguised as guests, made a subtle move to intercept, but a fractional shake of Jinwoo's head stopped them in their tracks. He was letting the animal come to the bait. Viktor stopped before their table, planting his hands on the pristine white linen. He was breathing heavily. Several nearby conversations faltered and died. A circle of silence began to expand around them. "Kwon," Viktor spat, his voice loud and accusatory. "Enjoying the party? You sit here, acting like a king while you hold an innocent woman captive." He pointed a trembling finger at Ilara. "This woman, Ilara Vance, has an obligation to me. We had a contract, an understanding. You used your money and your thugs to intimidate her, to steal her away." Ilara did not flinch. She simply looked at him, her expression one of mild curiosity, as if observing a curious, ill-behaved specimen. Her calmness seemed to infuriate him more than any denial would have. "Tell them, Ilara," he demanded, his voice rising to a near shout. "Tell them how he keeps you locked in that tower of his. You do not belong to him. You owe me." The words obligation and owe me hung in the now silent ballroom. They were the words of a man who saw people as property, as entries on a ledger. Jin-woo had not moved. He had not even looked at Victor. He was calmly sipping his water, as if this were a mildly interesting floor show that had been arranged for his amusement. He placed the glass down with a soft click, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Then, he finally turned his gaze to Victor. "You are mistaken, Victor," Jin-woo said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Miss Vance has no obligation to you. Your business arrangement, as I recall, was terminated, with prejudice." He slowly stood up. He was not a tall man, but his presence seemed to fill the space, to suck the very air from Victor's lungs. "You speak of contracts," Jin-woo continued, his tone conversational. "Let us discuss contracts. This morning, at 9 a.m. Seoul time, a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands completed its acquisition of Sokolov Global Logistics. Every share, every asset, every last paperclip. It was a hostile takeover. Brutal, I hear." He pulled his phone from his pocket and placed it on the table. The screen lit up with a legal document. "That holding company is a wholly owned subsidiary of my own. As of 9 hours ago, your company, Victor, is my company." A collective gasp went through the room. Victor stared at the phone, his face draining of all color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "The board of directors you appointed," Jin-woo went on, his voice a steady, merciless rhythm. "They were removed at 10 a.m. Your access to all corporate accounts was revoked at 10:05. The charming apartment you have been staying in, the one owned by your shell corporation, the eviction notice was filed at 10:15. The jet you flew here on was repossessed on the tarmac an hour ago. You will be flying home commercial, in economy." Each sentence was a nail being hammered into Victor's coffin. This was not a confrontation. It was an autopsy, performed live on the man's entire existence. "You came here tonight believing you had one last card to play," Jin-woo said, picking up his phone and turning the screen for Victor to see. It now showed a bank statement, a balance of 0. "You believe you are a player in a great game. You are not. You are a line item on a balance sheet that has just been zeroed out. You have no money. You have no company. You have no power. You have nothing." The finality of it hit Victor like a physical blow. The last vestiges of his manufactured confidence crumbled, leaving only the raw, pathetic terror beneath. His face, which had been red with anger, was now a waxy, chalk-white mask. His body began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shudder. "No," he whispered, the word a dry rattle in his throat. "No, you can't." He dropped to his knees. The sound of his expensive tuxedo pants hitting the polished floor was obscene. He was no longer looking at Jin-woo. He was looking at Alara, his eyes wide with a desperate, uncomprehending plea. He had built his entire desperate plan around her, and she had watched his destruction without saying a word. Then the sounds began. A low, wretched whimper which grew into a gut-wrenching sob. Victor Sokolov, the arrogant tyrant, the dealer in arms and chaos, knelt in the center of the most powerful room in the city and wept like a broken child. He was not sorry. He was caught. 2 of Jin-woo's men finally moved in, their faces impassive. They lifted the sobbing, collapsing man by his arms and began to drag him out of the ballroom. His ruin was absolute. It was not just financial, it was social, it was emotional, it was total. He had been unmade. Jin-woo watched him go, his expression unreadable. Then he sat back down, picked up his water glass, and took a sip. The show was over. The silence that followed the removal of Victor Sokolov was profound. It was a vacuum left by the sudden, violent collapse of a man's world. Hundreds of the most powerful people on the continent had just witnessed a public execution, carried out not with a weapon, but with a smartphone and a few quiet, devastating sentences. Jin-woo Kwan remained seated, the picture of calm, as if nothing more significant than a clumsy waiter dropping a tray had occurred. He turned his attention back to his table, to Alara. The rest of the room, for him, had ceased to exist, but the room was still watching. They were watching him, and they were watching the woman who had been at the center of the storm. Who was she? What was her role in this brutal corporate drama? Was she a victim? A prize? A co-conspirator? Jin Woo stood once more. He did not raise his voice, but a hush fell over the nearby tables, a silence that spread outward until the entire grand ballroom was listening. He held out a hand, not to the audience, but to Alara. She took it, her fingers cool and steady in his, and allowed him to draw her to her feet. "Many of you may be wondering about the events of this evening," he began, his voice carrying with its usual quiet authority. "You have just witnessed the conclusion of a necessary, if unpleasant, business transaction." He paused, letting the monumental understatement hang in the air. His gaze swept the room, and for the first time it was not cold or dismissive. It was direct, commanding. "There has been speculation," he continued, "gossip, rumors regarding my relationship with the woman standing beside me." He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Alara's. The look that passed between them was one of complete understanding, a silent conversation in a crowded room. The entire story was in that look: the contract, the bullet, the recovery, the late-night work sessions, the shared respect. Then he turned back to the audience. "Let me be clear. This is Alara Vance." He said her name as if it were an important announcement in itself. For the past year, Miss Vance has been the most capable person in every room she has entered, and no one has had the intelligence to notice. She is a brilliant architect and a strategist of unparalleled insight. The man who was just removed from this room made the fatal mistake of seeing her as a decorative object. He failed to understand that she was, in fact, the foundation upon which he stood, a foundation he foolishly tried to destabilize. He gestured vaguely in the direction Victor had been dragged. "What was once Sokolov Global Logistics has been restructured. It will be rebuilt from the ground up on a new, more solid foundation. Its operations will be folded into a new European logistics division under my parent company." He then did the last thing anyone expected. He turned fully to Alara, a look of profound respect on his face. "I would like to introduce you all to the architect and chief executive officer of that new division, Miss Alara Vance." A shockwave of stunned silence passed through the ballroom, followed by a hesitant, then growing wave of applause. It was a checkmate nobody had seen coming. He hadn't just destroyed an enemy. He had used the rubble of that enemy's empire to build a throne for her. He hadn't introduced her as his lover, his wife, or his possession. He had introduced her as his equal. He had given her a name, a title, and an empire of her own. It was the ultimate vindication. Her competence, her intelligence, the very things the world had overlooked, were now her public identity, announced to the world by the most powerful man in the room. Alara stood beside him, the sound of the applause washing over her. She felt a slow, profound exhale release from her lungs, a breath she felt like she had been holding for years. The weight, the constant, crushing weight of being underestimated, of being unseen, of enduring in silence. It was gone. In its place was a quiet, steadying sense of rightness. She felt correctly placed. Later that night, they stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the city sprawling beneath them like a carpet of fallen stars. The noise of the gala was a distant memory. Here, there was only the cool night air and the quiet hum of the metropolis. Alara was still in the emerald gown, a glass of champagne, untouched, in her hand. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, looking out at the lights. "Giving me the company." "I did not give it to you," Jin Woo corrected her, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "You earned it. Your strategies dismantled his allies. Your analysis of his company's weaknesses gave my team their roadmap. You were the architect of his downfall. I merely signed the checks." She turned to look at him. It was a very public statement. "It was a necessary one," he replied. "I wanted the world to see you as I see you, Not as a shield, not as a decoy, but as a queen. The word hung in the air between them, more potent than any declaration of love. He saw her not just as an equal partner, but as a sovereign in her own right. She finally smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. It was a smile free of performance, free of pain. And what does the queen do now? Now, he said, his voice taking on a softer tone. The queen chooses. The contract is fulfilled. The danger has passed. You are free, Ilara. You can take the company and build your own empire. You can go anywhere in the world. You have the resources to do anything you wish. He was giving her an out, the final, most important piece of her freedom. The choice. She looked away from him, back at the glittering city. She thought about leaving. She thought about a quiet life somewhere, designing beautiful buildings, free from the world of violence and power. She could have it. He had given her that. But then she thought about the quiet companionship of their late-night work, the way he listened to her ideas, the feeling of being truly seen and understood, the steady, grounding presence of him beside her. That quiet, safe place was not a location. It was a person. I don't leave because things become complicated, she repeated, turning back to him. And I don't leave when they finally become simple either. She took a step closer to him, into his space. The Decoy wife contract is terminated, she said, her voice a low, steady murmur. But I believe the position of partner is still open, and I am submitting my application. Jin Woo looked down at her, and the last of his formidable control seemed to melt away, replaced by a raw, unguarded warmth that she had only ever glimpsed before. He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "The position has been filled since the day I read your thesis," he confessed. "I was simply waiting for the candidate to accept the terms." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of quiet finality. It was a confirmation, a seal on a new contract, one not written on paper, but built on a foundation of shared scars, mutual respect, and the promise of a future they would architect together. They stood on the balcony, high above the world, no longer a sovereign and his shield, but two rulers looking out at their kingdom, ready to build what came next.